Today I want to take a look at securing a web API with Azure Active Directory using the ADAL library. That's Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. For the front end, we'll be looking at AngularJS 1, and there's a really good example on GitHub that we'll be working with. So we'll go ahead and grab the clone URL over here, copy that, come over into a new window, and we'll go ahead and make a directory. Yep, there's our new directory. And we'll change directory down into AngularJS spa ADAL. We'll run git clone, and we'll provide the URL to the project. At this point, we want to take a look at what's inside of that folder. So we'll do start space dot. And inside the folder path, we have our single page app project over to a README. Now, because this is an older front end with AngularJS, they have instructions here on the README that you need to switch into the master branch to find the source files and do a download zip because the project has been archived, and that download zip will go ahead and give you your source media, and we can open the SLN file. Opening the SLN, we can explore the project, and we see over here that we have an automation folder with some PowerShell script. We have a to-do spa for the single page app, and we have controllers. That'll be important. That's our web API endpoint. And then there's some configuration files, and of course indexes where the application is viewable. First off, we'll take a look at configure. So what this does is it will actually register your app in Azure Active Directory and go ahead and come back and give you the app ID GUID number and the client secret. It needs a little bit of input to do that. It's going to want a credential and a tenant. So what tenant are we connecting into, and what's the account? Now you will need the Azure AD module, so I want to make sure that's already installed on the command line. Come over here and do install module Azure AD. Already have it on this machine, so we're covered there. But configure PS1 will be the first thing we run because it provides us with our tokens. It gives us an app ID and it gives us a client secret. Now to go ahead and execute that, we are going to switch directories here, come into the app creation scripts. We see configure is available. And there's also a config.ps1. Registration for single page app, declaration of different variables. There's a tenant name, public client, single page app. So this is kind of the name of the app and what the redirect URL. So these are inputs for the registration process. Right now it's called singlepage.net app. You may want to change that to whatever the name of your app is, but these are inputs for configure to run. Names maybe could be better, but config are the inputs, configure is the execution. All right, so here we're going to go ahead and execute configure. It's going to want us to log in. I went ahead and put credentials there. And the PS1 is running. Creating the AAD application single page app.net. And then it says created, updating web config, updating app.js, and done. That's pretty cool. So not only does it register, but it also updates our local code. And to confirm the registration, we can come over to Azure AD, do a little reload, singlepageapp.net. Here we see it. We have our tenant. We have the name of the app. We have one redirect URL. We've got GUID numbers for app ID and tenant. A lot of really cool stuff going on. And you can come in here to API permissions and see what this is allowed to do as far as the permissions the app has. You can grant this various things with Office 365 and MS Flow and Power Automate, Power BI, SharePoint. even Microsoft Graph. There's a lot of different options that you have here for granting it permissions. I think that, with Azure Active Directory and kind of enumerating users are some basics that we'd like it to have. And of course, Microsoft's making a push for Graph. It's the largest button on the screen, and it includes Azure AD here and a whole bunch of other things. So we're going to open that up, and we're going to look at application permissions. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that you can use here as far as Teams and SharePoint and contacts and whatnot. We'll put user read all. As far as something with directory permissions, kind of to know who the current user is and maybe to enumerate other users on the tenant. We'll go and give it some basic permissions there just to kind of know about the current user. And we can go ahead and grant admin consent. Successfully completed. Cool. So now that we have that done, we're going to take a look at our web config, and we'll take a look at app.js. And we can see that in both of these files, we have a new client ID added for initializing ADAL. This is your ADAL provider into Angular. And there's the new client ID. And then with web config, this is the .NET backend. Same thing. There's the GUID number 343. And on the front end with JavaScript, there's a GUID number 343. So when we registered the app, the PowerShell went ahead and updated both the front and back end code for us, which is fantastic. Now we can execute the project, F5 to play, and we'll explore it to see if it authenticates correctly. So here we are looking at the simple localhost application that's up and running. And I've got the network console available. And we are looking at localhost for the to-do SPA, single page application. This is using Angular routing. So we have home and to-do as different routes. And over here, we have a login button. It's not logged in yet, but it can be. And what's going to happen is that certain routes and certain menus are only available if you're authenticated, and they'll trigger authentication. So I want to go ahead and do login and get that part started. So we're going to click login and watch the network traffic. Okay, so we did log in, and now we see log out in the corner, and we now have 3 routes available. The newest one is the word user. And you can see when we hit the login button, a couple of different things happened. It went into the ADAL library right here on the first line, and then it went to login on Microsoft.com for the second line. And that did the handshake in the background to get the tokens. From that point, it wanted to kind of refresh the display. But the most important part is the second one right here, that it did an authentication handshake and it was able to get a token. Now the browser session that I'm using is already logged in. That's opening a new tab over to office.com, click your name in the corner. We can kind of see that we're already logged in, we're already authenticated. So when I hit the login button here, it's using that same session to go ahead and generate a token for us. But now when I click on the user route, and we can see on our network traffic that opened the user data HTML view. But when I navigate into that route, we get all of this excellent token detail. Who is the current user? What's the UPN email address? What's the tenant ID number? The AUD number is actually the same as our Azure AD application. I think it means audience, but for our purposes here, it's the client ID. This number here exactly matches up with what we have in our source code for the app.js front end and the web config for backend. Now, the important thing about all of this is that the APIs are now secured, that whatever you did with your Web API project for serving data is not available anonymously. By using the authorize attribute, any HTTP gets and posts that come over here to retrieve data are going to be authenticated. And that's really important because whenever you're working with single page apps, you have to provide your own security. And really, you're not securing the front end, you're securing the back end for the data. So we have this display for the application, but we also have data behind it that we need to protect. Now for the application we're viewing, there is some data storage with SQL Server that's declared on the back end for the Web API. So the controller we were just looking at, it has the authorize attribute to engage ADAL and have security and not allow anonymous traffic. Okay. But it also has this database context of where it's storing data, and that's defined in web config. So over here you can see line 12 that we have this MS SQL local DB, and there's an MDF file, and that's where it wants to store data. That's not really the way I wanted to set things up because there's some other benefits you can get from having SQL Express, that it's something that's more graphical. It's persisted, it's running even when the project's not running. So I want to change the connection string here to be /SQL Express, and the database name is to-do. That is a simple brand new database running on localhost. So /SQL Express, database is to-do, and there are no tables. So I just came in here and did right-click new database, and that gives me a place for storing some of the information. Give this the new connection string, and we'll go ahead and hit F5. Now that provides a facility for persisted data, for storage, that even in between sessions, we have a way to locate and store our information. So over here, we can go to the to-do list and do hello 1. And you'll see that added it to the rows, hello 2, hello 3. And the reason to-do list is so popular with SPA's single page application is because it gives you all 4 CRUD operations that you're going to have create, you're going to have read, you're going to have update, and you're going to have delete. You get all of those. And being able to kind of demonstrate that here on a single page shows all the major data operations that you might need for a larger application. So what I just did, initialized a couple of tables, and if we came over here to SQL Studio, we can select the to-do table into a new query, and here we are. We can see our 3 records, and what's really interesting about this one is the owner attribute, APLP. I mean, what does that mean, right? So each user kind of gets their own partition of data storage. And the APLP value that we saw is coming here from Azure Active Directory. So this is our token that when we log into Azure AD, we have a username, but maybe that gets renamed at some point, and it could change over time. This is more of a unique key down here, and this is more of a display value that users really see as they're doing their login process. So, when you look at the data model directly, you're seeing that extra value to use as a identifier for which user's data is this. So having this persisted to SQL enables us to go ahead and track things and save data in between sessions. So you can log out, you can log back in, you can do all of that, and your data will be saved in between sessions. So there's our login process. We go through the redirects, we stay signed in, we go to to-do list, and our data continues to be saved there. So if you want to do log in, log out, and come back, your data is saved and secure. The to-do list that's giving us the JSON responses, we can inspect that here on F12, and we see all of our values. And this is from API/to-do list is the URL. So I want to copy that link address, put it into a new tab, and we get authorization has been denied because this is missing the headers. So the beautiful thing about what we've done here is securing the Web API endpoint. That this controller, when it's passing data for HTTP, gets and posts, it has an authorize attribute that only people who are logged in can receive data. And if you send it a generic HTTP GET, it's going to say you haven't logged in, the request is denied, there's no data coming. And that's really important for security. And if you want to look at the valid request a little bit more closely, it has headers. Here you go. Authorization bearer. There's this giant token of text. That is what provides our authentication. That's what's letting us log in. Now, there's a really cool website to know about called jwt.io. This text that we were seeing with our valid request, the authorization bearer, that's called a Java Web Token, JWT. And if we were to copy all that text over to jwt.io, paste it into the encoded box, on the right-hand side, it'll decode it and kind of break it into different pieces. And even here, you can hover and learn a little bit more about each one of these variables. That ISS is the issuer who created the token. You know, that down here we have sub. That actually is subject, whom the token refers to. And if you remember, that's our unique ID for the current user. So whenever you're dealing with Azure Active Directory and you see one of these authorization bearer tokens, you may want to paste it into JWT.io, and then you can get a little breakdown. And any of these values you hover, they'll kind of explain things to you as far as what the values mean and how they're used. And yeah, it's a really good tool to know about because no one can read this stuff on the left, but now it's broken into pieces. And you even have the ability to hover. Like these are interesting here. The expiration date, it converts it over to your local time zone just by hovering that text. So definitely want to know about JWT.io. So we covered the web config for securing the data on the back, app.js for securing the front. We have the routing experience for Angular. We have the login, logout, and we even covered how to create the application using PowerShell so that it's done consistently every time. Thanks for watching.